Well, I want to welcome you all back to session 3 of our series with Mark Tidsworth of the Pinnacle Leadership Group. We have enjoyed our first 2 sessions with him as we are focused on forming church cultures around the way of Jesus. Today, session 3, Cultivating the Sacred Spark. We have sort of been talking about this all along as we have talked about awakening imagination and the divine spark in that. So I am very excited to welcome Mark back for session 3. And we pray that the spark will be awakened in all of us and in him as he leads us today. Welcome back, Mark.
Thank you. Great to see you. Appreciate Terry and the invitation to be with you. And great to see those who've been here before and welcoming some new folks too. Well, there's a lot of ground I would like us to cover today, but let me pause before jumping in and just seeing if there are any insights and or questions. I've had lots of interaction with clergy and leaders this week and just have a bunch of anecdotes. But I wonder for you all, anything that's insights, questions before we jump into cultivating the sacred spark. All righty. Well, let's get
Mark, I'll say one thing. I have found opportunity multiple times since last week to use your words about what percentage of time has to be spent getting ready for change. And that's just outside the normal thinking, I think, of most of us who are just ready because we feel like, we are compelled to do something. And so we start providing leadership before we prepare the soil in the ways that needs to be. So that was a really good word.
That's great to hear. Thank you. Yeah, it's sort of the unseen work of leading change.
Correct.
And probably most of it is unseen. Cultivation work. All right, well, let's build on that then. Share my screen. And get to the right place on my computer. Here we go. Session number 3, there's that same tree from our backyard that now is totally bare. No leaves on it at all, but still remembering that. And today is Veterans Day, you might remember. It's a little surprising since it's not a Monday, but our oldest served in the military. He went to Afghanistan, and let me just read this as a shout out to him. Remembering that day when our veteran arrived stateside from Afghanistan, this dad shed some tears, as did we all. Such huge relief. So thankful, and lifting those today who suffer losses of loved ones to wars. As God continues to provide the strength, may we find the will to pursue peace, beating swords into plowshares. So I realize this is more of a prayer than a statement that I think God has already provided the strength, but may we as people commit again to pursuing peace as we follow the Prince of Peace. This is the scripture we've been using to orient us where their hearts were burning within them. And we are seeking to cultivate cultures in churches where we can't make this happen, but where there's a greater possibility, where we can position ourselves to be ready to encounter Christ in this way. So we're to our third, cultivating the sacred spark, and we add a few things here. I want to invite you to consider your image of a pastor today. And let's say pastor and congregational leader, because not everyone who is here is a pastor of a church. We have some lay leaders as well who are here. So congregational leader. insert that where I have pastoral leadership paradigm. What is your image of a person who leads a congregation at this point in time? And I want to suggest a specific one to you that I think will help us to cultivate the sacred spark. And it is these three words that just popped up on the screen: faith, change, agent. Change agent is not a new phrase, but inserting the word faith in front of it may be new for us. It's a paradigm it's a phrase and then a paradigm I've been using for the last several years based on the big shift of modern to postmodern. What do churches need? I think they need leadership who can help them navigate the changes to pursue embodying the gospel in this current world. That's a different role for clergy and lay leaders and church staff than what many of us were taught and trained to do. It's a very different way of leading than any of us have been prepared for in the past. So let me offer that for you, and we could go a long way with that, but I think through what we do today, you'll get an idea of what I'm talking about with this. All right, so rather than only 3 ways to cultivate the sacred spark, this is key practices of faith change agent, pastoral leaders, insert congregational leaders, knowing we have some lay leaders here with us too. There are far too many of these key practices than what we can pursue today. So our goal is to pursue the first 4 that are in bold. They are the primary ones, and then the second string, these last 2 on the right side that are in bold at the bottom, they will get an honorable mention towards the end of our time, but the first 4 we'll have time to pursue together. So I'll talk about one, pause, let you comment on it, ask questions, give some observations, then we'll do the second, the third, and the fourth, and I think we'll have time to do all of those. So faith change leaders, one of their primary functions is to cultivate the sacred spark and to help the Spirit rise in the life of our churches. That the Spirit then leads to transformation, to become greater expressions of the body of Christ. This is our aspiration, our aim. We talked about this in the previous 2 sessions. That's what we're headed towards, what we want to pursue. So it's a primary function of faith change agent leaders is to cultivate that sacred spark through relentlessly pursuing the mission, articulating the driving question, reinforcing every mission congruent move, working with those who want to work without fretting over the rest, so you can see where we're going. So let's just jump into the first one here. Relentlessly pursuing the mission and vision. The way we use those words are mission, meaning the high level description of God's mission. And it really doesn't change much over time. For example, the first bullet on the left side of the screen, God's mission is to bring the kingdom to earth as it is in heaven. This is one way to describe God's mission. And that really doesn't change much over time, no matter what's happening in the world. So we encourage churches to have a mission mantra, a very short, pithy, if possible, statement that captures our highest aspiration. So that's what we mean when I use the word mission. Vision is this particular church's part of the mission. As our church lives into that mission, what's our role? And that can be different depending on the chapters and the seasons of our life. So that's what I mean as I use these 2 words. And if the faith change agent, if their role is to relentlessly pursue the mission and vision, then there's an assumption. The assumption is this church knows its mission and it has identified its vision. So again, with mission, I mentioned a mission mantra. Some of you will remember the old days when mission statements were extremely long, multiple paragraphs, and nobody could remember it. It was printed somewhere in the back of the church library that nobody could find, and it really wasn't very useful or helpful, but we thought that's what we were supposed to do then. Now the philosophy is short, pithy, captures our aspirations, and can galvanize us in a certain direction. So here are a couple examples. Making Christ known in the community. I know the church that this is their mission mantra. They've changed it since I didn't remember to change it. Now it is making Christ known in God's community. So they replaced in the with God, recognizing it is God's community and God's at work in the community all the time. And our mission is to make Christ known in God's community. And then here's another one, making disciples for the transformation of the world. That one happens to be the United Methodist Conference. It's a worldwide communion. This is their mission statement for their worldwide communion. So let me pause and ask. I'm going to stop sharing for a moment, give you a heads up. Anybody have a mission mantra in your church that you feel good about and that you think is pretty helpful that you might mention?
We do not, but we, having adopted kind of a creative iteration of the liturgical year, we've become a thematic-based church where there's a different mantra connected to seasons. And in this particular moment, we've reclaimed one that was for a very long common season way back in the day. And now we're doing it for at least a full year, which is we make the road by walking, meaning one faithful step at a time, which is based on a Spanish poem that Brian McLaren, wrote a book that line is pretty well known, connected to the Camino in Spain. But we make the road by walking is one that we are just reiterating over and over.
Wow.
These days.
Well, sounds fantastic, especially for this period of time where strategic planning is extremely difficult to do because the world's changing so fast that we're just making the road as we are walking along. And are you using Brian McLaren's book in any way with that?
No, we have in the past. And we probably will again. I think for us, it's a heavy emphasis on we're walking with Jesus and he's making a way as we take one faithful step at a time is the idea behind this. In the past, we relied more heavily on McLaren's book. But
that's cool. Yeah. Okay,
yeah.
Thank you. Anybody else have one that you think is worth noting? All right, well, let's go a little further. So anytime we talk about the mission and the vision, we have to acknowledge institutional concerns. By institutional concerns, I mean the need to have funding for our church, the need to take care of the buildings, the need to provide paychecks for staff people, the need to populate our churches with people, have participants. So buildings, bodies, and budgets was the old shorthand way we used to say that. So whenever we talk about mission, so with this slide, it says mission over institutional concerns. Let me just read through these. When we pursue the mission first, we are far more invigorated. Increasingly, we dethrone institutional concerns to a lesser place than our first priority, remembering they are not the end of all things nor our bottom line. As I say this, I'm aware it's very easy to say. Those people in church who are tasked with nominating people to serve, who are tasked with creating a budget, who are tasked with maintaining our buildings. It's very challenging to put mission first when we have these institutional concerns. Number two, so when though we dethrone and remove them from our first priority to somewhere lower in the list, then some things open up for us. And number two, we have the spiritual stamina we need to address our institutional concerns well. So I'm realistic in saying our institutional concerns, if we own property, if we have any employees, if we want our churches to be populated, they're not going away. They are part of the mix, and they are real, and they will remain part of the mix. The challenge for us is simply to keep first things first, that the mission of God and joining God's mission is our first priority. And then we use these tools to help us to get there. It's so easy to get those two things reversed and have one above the other. So, but when we can make mission first, then we have the spiritual stamina we need to address our institutional concerns. And number three, we are far more likely to strengthen as an organization when we are missionally engaged and being transformed than when we are afraid of our institutional concerns or driven by them. Let me show you the next slide that will make a little more sense of this. When our institutional concerns become our number one priority, the invitation we end up giving to people in the world about coming and being a part of our church is this: come join us. We will meet your needs and make you happy in exchange for your help in building our numbers and our budget. Now, hardly anybody would ever say that out loud. This is an unacknowledged church invitation or covert church invitation, but I think it's present to some degree in many churches and maybe most churches. It's present in some degree. I find myself struggling with this one. And if I'm really honest, why? And so we have to ask ourselves, why do we want to engage people in our world? How much of it is so that they can join us to help us achieve our goals, or because we love them in the name of Jesus? And if we love them in the name of Jesus, it's about partnering with them around God's mission rather than using them to help us do what we need to do. So I don't think I'm splitting hairs here. I hope what I'm doing is acknowledging the truth of the difficulty of being institutional leaders while trying to be faithful to the gospel of Jesus Christ. There is an inherent tension in there. And so it is good for us to remind ourselves, here's the invitation we want to get to, the missional church invitation. Come join us in partnering with God and our community to transform this world towards God's kingdom. This is the invitation we want to get to, because in just a very practical sense, with people who are not a part of our churches, when they sense this first invitation, the consumer church invitation is where we're coming from, they run for the hills as quickly as they can, because they sense the desperation in the water, they sense the fear, they recognize, well, you want me here so that I can help you with your problem, which is to prop up your metrics in your church. That's why you want me here. People have this radar on their heads, and they can pick it up when they encounter a church. They also will know when we are genuinely interested in them for the sake of the kingdom of God. They can sense this as well, that you want me because Christ has become real to you. And in Christ being real to you, you want Christ to be real with me. And you're about something that's really important, and you want me to partner with you towards transforming the world towards God's kingdom. So I think this is the last slide. Oh, you all will likely know the name Israel Galindo. Galindo, I'm sure Terry does, because he used to be in Virginia and now he's in Decatur. And likely you've read this book as well. But I love and hate this statement, both at the same time. Leaders, congregational leaders, must challenge those who lack the courage to move forward due to a lack of faith or an inability to share in the vision, speak truth to power at times. They must have the courage of conviction to choose the vision over relationships. Rarely will a congregation that embraces a new vision bring everyone along. So the first time I read this, which was when I was reading Israel Galindo's book, I bristled with this statement. Being a relational person, wanting to bring everyone in the church forward, to choose vision over relationships, recognizing we may lose some people, but then I compared it to my experience and recognized, well, that seems to happen. If the church becomes clear on who it is and what it's about, there will be some people who will say, I didn't really sign on to that. I'm not sure I want to do that, and who will choose to not be a part of that. And so our alternative is to make it a consumer-oriented church where we try to keep as many people happy as long as we possibly can and not really stand for much of anything or do much of anything besides keep people happy, because then that's a full-time job. Or we can partner with God towards a mission and ministry and be clear about who we are and what we're pursuing, knowing not everyone will go forward, but there will be other people who will be drawn to this and who will want to participate with it. All right, so I think that is my last slide on that one. So let me stop sharing for a moment and just see, what are you hearing in this? How's it sitting with you? What questions does it bring, and or pushback, or any of the above? Just how you're responding as you see it and hear it.
When I first came to Tabernacle, there was a palpable sense that we were really desperate for families with children. And I can remember thinking as a first-time senior pastor, it's like when somebody walks in the door, we want to lock the doors and get them here as soon as possible. Like it really felt desperate. And I don't even think that people knew that they were doing it because the desire was so genuine, but it was overwhelming. And ultimately, it's a long story that I will not share today by any means, but the long story short is, over a period of a year, a few years into my ministry, half of us were refugees from Burma. There's a congregation that was half and half, and we couldn't speak each other's languages. And it was the surge of growth. Like, we doubled in size. And then there was a wave of teachers, social workers, seminary students, a couple of pediatricians that we did not anticipate. And it's exactly what you're saying. It was that people wanted to be part of a church willing to give herself away. And the more complacent that we get, or the more that we've enjoyed community, the harder it is. People are drawn to those that actually give themselves away, because you've got something there that's worth dying for. We could have never planned that. Like, I don't know that I could have ever presented this to the church. It just by God's grace, it happened. But we lived into that truth, and it was pretty beautiful. But you can't capture it again. Like, it's a constant reminder of dying to self, I think.
Thank you. Yeah. Anybody else want to respond to what relentlessly pursuing the mission and vision?
I would say that the cost that there is to pay is, I think that like Kent and I can agree about that, but then it's getting people to also, on the pews, to understand that it's a challenge, that this is what growth looks like. This is what change looks like. And there is a cost, but there are also, to get them to see the other side of that. Because people don't think about this stuff all day long like we do.
Yeah, we've had a very small number of disgruntled people. And, our congregation is desperate to do whatever they can to keep those people around. And I keep saying growth always requires that some people are going to be disheartened and leave. And we need to embrace letting them leave and finding a better place. And that will free us up to grow too.
Yeah.
I was just going to add, I think that, these are always hard words for people, but I think they're especially hard during a time of pandemic when there has been so much change already that people have not been able to control. The idea, churches are worried about surviving right now. And the idea of, people are mad about everything. They're bringing that to church. And we're not going to focus on relationships. We're going to focus on mission and living out what God calls us to do. And if that's not what God's calling you to do, well, then God bless you as you leave. Like, I'm in total agreement with that. I'm not disputing what you're saying, but I am acknowledging, and I think it's important to acknowledge, like, while that's hard for congregants to swallow and some folks to swallow even during normal times, I think that pill is even more bitter right now for a lot of folks.
Yeah, great observation. And I think we talked about last time or the time before, reconnecting. That right now, especially, helping people reconnect with their faith and with the faith community is really, really important for all those reasons Chris just mentioned, that this is a natural, normal human desire. And so where we're going is reconnecting for the purpose of, that's where then this part comes in. We do want to reconnect. We are the body of Christ. So there's just that image means reconnecting and being in relationship with one another. Yet we are the body of Christ that's moving and that's on mission with God in the world. And like the Apostle Paul, seeking the upward prize of Christ Jesus. So we're connected with one another as the body of Christ, seeking to move towards that prize. So, well,
so Mark, how do we become an unlearning church? We have. I love your contrast of the invitations, but it is so clear in many of our congregations. You can even observe it when you go and visit churches. You can see how the people have been trained to gravitate to the people like them. And so you get a family that shows up on Sunday morning. Everybody rushes to make those people feel welcome. You get a single person who shows up and nobody goes and talks to them at all. I remember when we moved once and we were looking for a new church home, and a well-meaning lay person in the church came to me, and he knew who I was, and he said, you need to join here. We need your tithe. That's all he said.
wow.
But he's being honest, but it also reveals the truth of the contrasting visions that you have laid out in terms of invitation.
Yeah.
How do we unlearn?
Yeah. I think it's that it's just the gospel of Jesus Christ. He encouraged. Well, you remember he's the one who said, if you want to follow me, deny yourself, take up your cross and follow me. Mm-hmm. And the disciples tried to talk him out of talking this way, knowing it would scare people away. And some of them left because he taught this way. And so I find myself asking, why did he talk this way? What's that about? And I think what it's about is when we quit focusing on ourselves, that's when resurrection happens. And that's when life happens. When we are willing to lay down our primary desires and our selfishness and to say, not my will be done, but thy will be done. That's sort of the essence of the gospel, that when we get there, remarkably, we come alive and we experience this kind of life that there's no way to get by focusing on ourselves. And I think this dynamic we're talking about in church is that this dynamic multiply, that the churches who are willing to give themselves away and to say our purpose is to join God's mission in the world, and they can get there and maybe stay there for a little period of time, they discover a kind of life they would never discover otherwise. And I think what happens then is their eyes are open and they see these possibilities for how they can move forward in partnering in mission with others and living into God's mission and being disciples. And it opens up possibilities for them that they would not discover otherwise. And it's just, for the skeptics among us, sometimes they will hear you if you simply say, with the new people who want to come to your church, if they sense that you are desperate as a church, you're going to scare them away. And for the skeptic, even if they don't care about theology, they don't care about spirituality or faith, and they do care about their church's survival, they'll at least hear that we don't want to scare people away. And so maybe that back off on that a little bit. But so let's just take this a little further then. So remember, we're talking about cultivating the sacred spark. So it's not one thing that's going to do that, but it's going to be multiple things that does that. And one of them is pursuing the mission, relentlessly pursuing the mission and holding it up as often as possible, along with, secondly, pursuing the driving questions. One of the neat things about leadership is we get to frame the narrative. We get to ask the questions. If you're a preacher, you get to ask questions every Sunday if you want to. You get to present something to your people every week, which is a remarkable opportunity. And if you're a lay leader, you get to present questions too. So let me share a few of these. Terry has seen some of these with the Making the Shift work. I want to share them again because they mean a lot to me personally. What does it mean to be a disciple of Jesus Christ? What does it mean to be disciples who join God's mission to remake the world? What's it mean to partner with others towards being disciples and joining God's mission? What's it look like to be church in this community at this time? As opposed to other questions like, how can we get more people in here? How can we boost our numbers? How can we increase our giving? These might be helpful at some point, but they don't drive us very well. Phase change agents get to choose the driving questions. And let me show you a contrasting slide. I already mentioned these a little bit. A church that gets caught up in the anxiety about its institutional concerns. These are the questions on the left side of the screen that they will be asking. Even if they don't ask them overtly, it's the conversation beneath the conversation. Are people happy? Are we keeping people happy? Is everyone comfortable? Is anyone upset? Are there any problems to address to make people more comfortable? If you listen closely, you can hear that's the conversation. These are the questions they're asking below the other conversation. What we want to do is move, if wherever we are with that, move towards the right side of the screen. And it is a process that takes place over time. The questions I just had on the previous slide, there they are again. They are missionally focused questions, body of Christ focused questions. How can we partner together? So on and so on. So how do we help our people get there? One way is just through activities like this, I think. In addition to preaching the gospel and all the other things that we're already doing, maybe having some times where we have a slide just like this and we put it up there and talk through it and to say, if this is a continuum, most churches are probably not all the way on the left side or totally on the right side. we're probably a mix of these. So if this is a continuum on the screen, where would we place our church these days? Where do we spend most of our energy and our time? Is it closer to the left side, or right in the middle of the left side, or right in the middle of these two? Or are we leaning to the right? Or where are we going? With the idea is, let's identify where we are, and then what do we need to do to take a step to move towards the missionally driven questions, a culture that values the missional questions. What's our next step in growing in this direction? So a faith change agent, congregational leader, might lead those kinds of discussions with the leaders of the congregation. A faith change agent leader can't make it happen all by themselves. They're going to need some partners in this. And to cultivate some partners might be raising this kind of discussion to the surface and inviting people into it. And if you've done this sort of thing, you will recognize people are generally delighted to be able to talk about the real stuff. It's a little bit challenging at times, but once they get into it, they are finally glad we're talking about the important stuff that makes a difference for us. All right. One last statement on this, quote on this. Let me read this one. It's to summarize what we've been talking about. When commissioning the disciples, preparing the disciples through parables, training, and modeling, Jesus did not appear overly concerned about pleasing his disciples. In fact, the disciples often asked Jesus to tone it down, afraid he would run off potential members with all his talk about denying self and taking up crosses. Instead, Jesus held up the picture of a way of life which is a pearl of great price, a treasure in the field, worth everything we value. So how well does the consumer church reflect the founder, the author and perfecter, pioneer of our faith? All right, the outcomes of this, it focuses us, diminishes comparison thinking, and helps us drop mission incongruent activity. All right, let's go ahead. I'm not going to pause and we'll talk about this one, but let's talk about these next two and then I'll pause and we'll talk again. Faith change agents, a third key practice, reinforcing every mission congruent move for specific actions. So if you want to jumpstart the culture of your church, moving from consumer church towards missional church, this is an excellent way to do this. Assumptions. I can tell you leaders are more influential than they know. Don't underestimate the influence of your congregational leadership. It does make a difference. And let me give you an example of that. And I'll ask you a question. This comes from emotional intelligence research, which we've done a lot of training with. We don't do as much as we used to, but we used to do a lot of training with it. The number one factor influencing employee retention is not church, but businesses, corporations, educational institutions. What would you guess? And it depends on what list you read. There are lots of different lists on this, but with emotional intelligence research, what would you guess is the number one factor influencing employee retention? It's different now during COVID, but let's say before COVID.
Feeling valuable.
Yes, that's it. And the way that plays out is this. I was very surprised by this when I first saw this. Employees will stay on the job longer when their relationship with their supervisor is either positive or negative rather than non-existent. So let me say that another way. The number one factor, according to emotional intelligence research, influencing employee retention is their relationship with their supervisor. And they will stay longer if they have a positive or negative relationship with the supervisor than if they get no attention at all from the supervisor. So let's say a supervisor who thinks you're doing a great job, and so she just generally leaves you alone, is more likely to lose that employee than a supervisor who is a bear to work with and who is micromanaging or difficult to get along with. People will stay longer in the job with that supervisor than the one who leaves them alone. And it's because people value connection with the supervisor, relationship with the supervisor. And when they have none, they interpret that as meaning, I have no value here. What I do doesn't matter because I don't get positive or negative interaction feedback from my supervisor. So this says what leaders tend to directly influences and shapes the culture of the organization. And we are always training people in our churches what we value and who we value. So reinforcing every mission congruent move. What do we mean by that? Number one, noticing those responding to faith change agent moves, and then leaning forward. You as congregational leaders, pastors, and lay leaders who are here in this meeting today, what you pay attention to, others notice. And so when you pursue the mission, you hold up the mission and vision, you ask these driving questions, pay attention to those who are sitting up in their chairs, those who are coming alive, those who are leaning forward. And when they do, not only pay attention to them, but follow up conversations with them. Notice those who are responding positively. And then number two, proactively and personally investing in those who are ready. Readiness, we talked about this last time, is a big deal. Not everybody is ready to move forward in mission and ministry. And I'll come back to this in just a moment because it's really important, but some people are. So what I'm suggesting is when you notice those who sit forward in their chair, who are resonating with the mission and vision, who their energy is up, go ahead and spend time with them and cultivate relationship with them. Affirm their energy and their interest, inquire about their energy and interest, encourage their sensitivity to the Spirit, and invite them to speak up. You might actually say to them, we need your voice. We need your voice at the table. You have some really good energy for moving forward in this church. We want you to find your voice and bring it to the table. As opposed to, sometimes, let me say it that way, pastoral leaders and congregational leaders spend most of their time tending to those most resistant to forward movement. You know the old saying, the squeaky wheel gets the grease. Maybe 80% of the congregation is ready to move forward and to do some holy experimenting, to do some appropriate risk taking, to step out of their comfort zone a little bit and try something that this church has not tried before and senses a call to do that. Maybe 80%, but 20% aren't. Out of that 20%, 15% are not going to object, but they're not going to participate. They're just going to observe, but 5% of them are objecting to this and are making noise about it. It's remarkable to me that clergy and church staff and lay leaders will spend 80% of their time tending to those 5% that are objecting to what we're doing. What we're suggesting instead is not to fret over them too much, and instead proactively, personally invest in those who are ready to move forward. That's number two. Number three, help the silent majority find their voices. For long-term culture change to happen in congregations, leaders can't do it on their own. They don't need everyone in the church on board, but they need more than just one person in the church on board. We need several people. to be on board to cultivate positive movement. And the best way for that to happen is for their peers to be the ones who invite and convince them to move forward. So positive peer pressure. Number 4, cultivate and build a movement, culture shaping. So I'm not going to spend a lot of time on this screen, but move on to this. And just let me move on to let me read through these. Work with those who are ready to move ahead. Others who are not so ready, observe. Here's what happens. Others who are not so ready, observe the movement and action. Let's just say only 20% of your congregation is ready to move forward with any particular holy experiment. Don't worry about the other 80%. Bless them where they are. Go with that 20%, they move forward. And what happens is some of the 80% will observe, and they will be drawn into movement and action, not because someone made the argument that convinces them, but because they observed and they were drawn into it, convinced by others in the game. Those who are not ready or even resistant, then don't take up too much of the energy or attention in the system. And the faith change agents' best energy goes to those who are eager for and interested in transformational ministry. So let me share this next one. This is the 4th one, and then I'll pause and see what questions you have or conversation we might have. Work with those who are ready to work without fretting over the rest. So this is an extension of what we were just talking about, but it's more specific, without fretting over the rest. It comes from family systems theory, if you know that, started by Murray Bowen, a clinician, and then Edward Friedman, who popularized it among congregations. And then lots of people have written many books on it ever since. And it's a great way to view systems of people that are connected with one another. I used to be a therapist. I was a pastor, but I also was a therapist for a good while. And this was taught to us when we do family counseling. When you do family counseling, there's always somebody or several somebodies who want to be there, and they're probably the ones who set up the appointment. And there's always somebody or somebodies who do not want to be there, and they were drug in to the counseling session. And so beginning therapists ask, well, what do I do with that? And many of them, beginning therapists, spend a lot of time trying to convince those who don't want to be there why they should be there, why this is good for them, why they ought to do it. And it's usually not very productive. And so the guidance instead is just go ahead and work with those who are ready to work, and don't sweat too much those who aren't. And what happens is, as you start getting into the issues and working on stuff, those who are resistant to being there don't want to be left out. They want their voice to be a part of it, and they start participating as well. Not because you convince them to, but because of the movement. They want to be a part of that. So this is a way to address resistance sideways, you might say, through culture shaping, not addressing it directly head on, though there are times we have to do that, but they are the exception rather than the rule. The rule is go ahead and move forward, work with those who are ready to work, don't sweat the others too much, bless them, love them, care for them, but don't spend inordinate time trying to convince them. Focus on the mission and the vision, the driving questions. This leads to movement. It creates coalitions of people that move forward, and eventually some of the others will come and join. And what the big thing about that is the faith change agents' energy can be multiplied. And rather than congregational leaders burning out because they spend 90% of their time with the squeaky wheel, they are energized and able to sustain movements over time. All right. Well, I pushed the wrong button. Let me stop sharing here. That's the right button. Covering a lot of ground, sharing a lot of things with you. I'm curious, what's your response? Where's it taking you to, and or questions that you have as we're talking about this?
One of the blessings and curses of longevity in a pastorate, I've been here almost 17 years, is the awareness that in not addressing the squeaky wheel, we just find creative workarounds. But the problem is the church keeps putting people in the same leadership positions and the squeak gets louder. And if you ignore it long enough, it feels like sabotage. I'm just curious, like, it's a loaded question because, how do you know when to address the squeaky wheel? At what point do you come to realize the squeaky wheel is actually creating something in culture that's going to be a hindrance to what you're describing?
Mm-hmm. Yeah. Well, I can give you a long-term answer to that. It's not a short-term thing. Under the heading of creating cultures that are gathered around forward movement with mission and ministry. And you remember I mentioned helping the silent majority find their voice. I think that's the best way to address some of this, is that when you start hearing congregational leaders speaking up for the mission and vision, then it's far more likely that your church is going to move forward in missional sorts of ministries. And so that's the strategy behind cultivating those who are ready and helping them find their voices. Let me give you an example. I was a pastor of a church after a big conflict. Almost half the church left. Most of the people who left were the families and children. So middle-agers and older senior adults were left with a few youth. There were a few youth, but no children under 6th grade. And so they were, so the first question was, are we going to survive as a church? And they decided they were going to survive as a church. And then they started some healing work, moving forward with healing work. And they had developed a habit of treating one another pretty disrespectfully as a church. And on the lay leadership team, they would speak to one another in ways that you wouldn't want to talk to your family that way or anybody else, but they, for whatever reason, they had developed this. And so I found myself just asking, is this what it looks like to be church for you all? I'm new. Is this what you all believe church looks like? Is this what it means to you to be church? And just started asking a bunch of questions like that. And it took a while, but after a while, when that would happen again in the lay leadership team meetings, one of the people who was there, a lay leader, a disciple in the church who was on this team, they would start turning to one another and say things like, we don't do that anymore around here. That's not the way we're going to be church now. We used to do that, but we're not going to do that anymore. We don't talk like that to each other anymore. So I could say that all day long, but I didn't really have the capital to change the system myself. But these people live with one another. They're peers of one another. They are there. I'm long gone from that church. I'm not there anymore, but they're still there with one another. When they started saying to each other, we're not going to be church that way anymore. We're going to be church this way. Here's what we're going to do now. I had my hope for that church went way up because I knew they'll listen to one another and they value with what one another. So I'm not trying to discount the role of clergy or church staff or lay leaders. What I am saying, I think the role of them is to shape the culture where the resistance is addressed, but not necessarily from the person who can be scapegoated and banished from the system. Because that's the old way of doing it, is the pastor comes in and confronts these people, and then they get mad at the pastor and the pastor's sent packing. And so pastors are vulnerable in this sort of way if they don't have the capital. They've not been there for 17 years. They don't have the capital to do this. And so another approach is to cultivate the people, cultivate those who are ready and those who want to move forward, to help them find their voice and encourage them to speak up and start finding their voice with their peers. And after a while, it changes the conversation among people.
I'm sitting here wondering, the language that we put in front of people, do we do it often enough? Do we paint the picture? Like the little statements. Kent and I have been privately messaging, the church probably needs a more concise, this is who we are. And maybe in our liturgy, reminding ourselves at the beginning and the end. I think sometimes we, being a non-creedal people, we lose something in that people aren't programmed in the best of way, or maybe keeping the language of invitation to the journey. We've talked about, we make the road by walking, which I still 52 Sundays from that book before at a different church, but it worked for people. They understand going on a trip, or the canoeing the mountains, that leadership book, which is, it works painting the picture for people, but consistent, and remembering that we don't have the people there, but maybe once a month. That's something we're trying to reconsider, how our messaging is going out. Has anyone tried using their statement or a clear picture at least once a week with your people?
Well, I was in a meeting this week with a bunch of clergy, and one of them did our Making the Shift process several years ago, and they came up with their mission mantra, and he said, it's printed on our worship guide. We use it at the beginning of the service. Each time we use it at the beginning. I'm not sure he said we use it at the end, but they use it at the beginning of the service. It's integrated into their liturgy in a variety of ways, and everybody in church knows it now. They've used it long enough that everybody in the church knows it. So they can use it to guide many of the things that they do.
And to point people back. It'd be nice to point and say, no, this is who we decided we are. This is who God told us who we are. Steer back onto the path.
Right. It's really hard in church to know what to do, because everything needs doing. And everything in the community needs doing. There are 1,000 things we can do in the community that would be worthy, and somebody ought to do them. But no one church can do 1,000 things. And so I think it's identifying what's our thing to do right now, and to make it a short enough list that we can say yes to that with some wholeheartely say yes to that. And that also equips us to say no to some other things. In the coaching group I was in earlier this morning with pastors, one of them drew on the board all these arrows that going in different directions, and saying that's what our church was like before, because somebody would have an idea and it'd be a good idea. So we would follow that good idea, but then somebody else would have a different one and a different one, different. And we're all pulling in different directions. And so we didn't really move very far together. But instead, he drew other arrows. Now we are all moving in the same direction, and we know what to say yes to and what to say no to. So there might be some wonderful things that somebody should do, but a church's answer might be, yes, somebody should do that. Let's see who has a calling to pursue that. That's not us right now. We got these other things that we're pursuing. So it can help us say yes and help us to say no. All right, so we're talking about cultivating the sacred spark, and when it starts to show up, to pay attention to it. When we see the energy rising, when we see these signals, when we see people sitting forward in their seats, we see people talking about things, when their energy's up, to go with that and take these as signs of the Spirit's enlivening of the church and move in that direction. And then the individuals with the church, I think at first it's just individuals. When you see individuals having ideas and having energy and passion to spend time with them and invest in them. Many churches are excellent at pastoral care, caring for people when they are hurting, and we have great systems for that. Sometimes we develop things like the Stephen ministry. You know, there are great systems for delivering care to people in churches. What about all those people who don't have a care need right now? They're generally doing okay. It's probably the silent majority. They're generally doing okay, but they would be delighted if someone wanted to invest in them to help them use their gifts for mission and ministry. And someone who would notice them and lean towards them and to say, hey, I've noticed you, and you seem like you have some passion for this, or you got some gifts for this. Help me to know you. And so intentionally, proactively developing disciples, so to speak, who don't have a problem. They're not a squeaky wheel, not causing difficulty, but they may be ready. They may be ready. And I'm thinking a nice byproduct of that for lay leaders and clergy leaders is it helps us avoid burnout. It helps us be energized because remember when, before you were called into pastoral ministry, and part of your picture of that was, I'll get to talk to people about their faith journeys. That's part of what I'll get to do. And then you realize, well, a lot of it's running an organization, and there's a lot of administrative work and you had to learn, well, that's just part of it, and I need to be good at that as well. But this is a way to also invest in people and individuals and help cultivate their faith. And it's energizing to everybody involved. Ben. All right, any other comments? And I'll have 2 more slides to share with you, and then we'll have some finishing comments. Terry?
Mark, I was going to say it's really important to remember that sometimes lay leaders will give vocational ministers permission to lead in certain directions, but it takes a lot of persistence of doing things over and over, and then the experience in itself is what ultimately helps them move in new directions. I could tell you so many stories, but there is nothing more gratifying when you've done some of this missional work and maybe even going past that to start thinking about incarnational work. When you show up in a business meeting and you're starting to make hard decisions about how you're going to invest the resources entrusted to this congregation, and the lay people stand up and say, wait a minute, we agreed. These are our highest values. These are the things we're going to invest in. We're not going to put money there because that's not who we are anymore. As long as we as the staff are the ones saying those things, you have not really affected change. But when those voices start speaking up and saying, this is not true, this is not congruent with who God is calling us to become. We're always on the journey. We're always in the process of becoming. But that's when it really becomes gratifying. But that does not come without a lot of investment in doing it over and over again. And then ultimately you're giving it away and it becomes theirs. So it's really about the questions leadership is about the questions we raise, and you did a good job of raising the questions we should be asking. But leadership is always about questions we're unwilling to raise as well.
Thank you. Well, so we talked about this last time, I think, shifting from fear to faith. And by this, I don't mean ignoring obvious concerns like a pandemic among us. I'm not talking about that sort of thing. What I'm talking about is moving from a defensive posture to a proactive posture. If we ever needed groups of people in this world who are not afraid and who are moving forward in confidence, it is now. And it seems like God's church has probably been given everything it needs to do that. I've been told over and over again, do not be afraid, do not fear. We looked at this slide last time. Here's a prettier version of that one. And I'll share it with you, but and then pursues the dream without becoming the dream. So these are, you can see there's a lot we did not cover today, but these are the some of the primary ones for faith change agents. Relentlessly pursuing the mission and the vision, getting as clear as we can on that, and then relentlessly pursuing it, like Diana shared, consistently coming back to it regularly, over and over and over again. And then articulating and pursuing the driving questions, reinforcing every mission congruent adaptive move. We don't have to produce those ourselves, but when they show up, we simply reinforce them. And then working with those who are ready to work and not fretting over or spending inordinate amounts of energy over those who just aren't ready for whatever reason. But these are high payoff moves for faith change agent leaders. All right, well, let me ask you one thing then, and just to see what we are taking from this, which is, what are you taking from this? So something, an idea, thought, insight, what are you gaining today that you may take, one thing you might take with you as a result of our time together today?
One of the things that I think it's more implicit than explicit, but it's super helpful to me, which is I don't feel like I'm giving a lot of time and energy to those that are so resistant, but I'm giving them the majority of my mental energy. I'm in conversation with them, even with them not in the room, and I haven't seen them physically in 2 weeks. I came to, in the worst of the pandemic for me in leadership and just all the disorientation, later I came to terms with the fact I think I was preaching to 12 people the whole time in my head. I wasn't preaching to the people in front of me. I was preaching to the 12 people that I'm in a silent conversation with in my own head. And so I think that plays a role here, is like just being self-aware enough, praying that God will reveal to you, where is it these folks are taking your energy, even though you can't prove it on paper. Wow. It feels validating. It feels validating to me in all kinds of ways on that front.
That's a great insight. Thank you, Sterling.
It's, for me, it's a reminder of the importance of quality lay leadership. And so, every church has those squeaky wheels, those people who complain. No church is absent those people. And here it was pretty quickly, I could pretty quickly figure out who those folks were. They made themselves pretty readily available or apparent, I should say. They weren't hidden. And most of the congregational leaders ignore those folks too, but we've got a few who, for whether it's personality or because of what they do, their goal is to make them happy. And I've tried to tell them, you're not going to make them happy. Their function in this system is to be unhappy. Like the same folks who give me problems, gave my predecessor problems, they gave his predecessor problems, they gave his predecessor problems. That is their function in this system. And they don't leave because they couldn't do that anywhere else. So they're not going anywhere. They're our problem. And I'm not going to focus on them. But some of our congregation, and most of our congregational leaders understand that, but there are a few who just, Chris, we got a problem, so-and-so's upset. And it's like, well, yeah, they're always upset. That's who they are. Like that's what they do. Like, why are we wasting bandwidth and energy for people who are always upset and angry? And to be able to move fully in this missionally driven direction, it's not just staff, but it is lay leaders who need to understand, congregational leaders who need to understand, that's just Bob, or that's just Jane, or that's just whomever, and they're not going to be happy. but they're not going anywhere. There are curmudgeons, there are Grinches or whatever. God love them, and we are too, but we're not going to give them the microphone or let them steer this bus. And I want to like record everything you said and like play this in deacons meetings and play this in all of our leadership meetings and just say, are you hearing what he's saying? Because I mean, it's 100% true.
Thank you, Chris. You said that well.
I think the challenge is we do give them microphones and we put them in leadership because you create a culture where nobody else wants to be in leadership. So by default, they've got a microphone. That's part of the challenge is the voices get loud.
Well, and the other thing I think too is, I mean, churches they're worried about size. They're worried because churches generally are shrinking. And so we ought to be asking those missional questions, but there's this internal anxiety that's produced because fewer and fewer people go to church, and we can't afford to lose people, whatever that means. Right. And that fear then pushes us in the opposite direction towards that consumer-driven mentality that we really need to be going. And so it's the unhealth is reinforcing itself. And expanding, and so it's it's challenging.
Yeah, that's a real life thing. That's a real life thing, and so in no way do we want to pretend that's not there. And institutional concerns are real. We do need to pay salaries. We do need to take care of our building. We do need to tend to our business. That's a part of church. But it is shifting the mindset to these are the assets and tools we have to help us to be church. They're not the goal. They're not the mission. They're not our highest aim. Our highest aim is to become ordinary human beings who look more like Jesus and who look more like Jesus next week than they do this week, and who partner with God towards transforming the world towards the kingdom. That this is our primary aim. And then let's use whatever tools we can find to help us to do that. And, when you think about it, it's obvious. People are far more likely to come join us when we are caught up in something that's life-giving and that we are passionate about and that draws us forward, as opposed to our worst fears. When we present first with our worst fears, which is we're afraid our church is going to go out of business. If that's what we present with, then who wants to be a part of that if you're not a part of it already? People are not just volunteering to come down to the church and help pay the light bill to keep the lights on. They don't care about that. They are asking, is there any hope for this world? Is there any group of people who can help overcome the divides in our culture? Is there any group of people who knows how to talk about stuff with each other without breaking apart? Is there love in this world that can overcome the huge problems we have? Where's the hope? That's what people are looking for. And so when we can get there, it's far more likely that some others will want to be a part of that than the other culture we are just contrasting it to. So I think it's holding that up over and over and over and over again, preaching it, teaching it. When we hear it, when we see it showing up in our churches, holding it up and saying, this is the church being the church. That's it. When you just did that, that's it. That's what we're looking for. And that's what I mean by the influence of leaders. There are CEOs of many organizations who would pay big bucks to be able to address the people in their company once a week for an hour. Pastoral leaders get to do that every week. And so one of the first ways to help this culture change, awakening spiritual imagination, and I see we're close to our time, is when you see it happening, hold it up and say, here's what it looks like. When you are doing this, you are being the church. and you are living out our mission and our calling. When you did that, that's the church meeting. And the power of that is the rest of us, when we hear that and we see that, we go, oh, well, that's what we're looking for here. Okay, well, how would I do that? Or what's my part in that? Or where do I go with that? And so holding up these, it's a way to connect vision to real life that's happening already. All right. Anybody else with what are you taking from this conversation today?
Mark, I appreciate your focus on investing in the wise and healthy people in your church who can ultimately become those E.F. Huttons that can stand up to the system and make these proclamations. This is who we are. We're not going to do that. We're not going to be that. And I loved your story. And I had a story from another church where this 80-something-year-old lady got wind of a person who was stirring a stink in the church and trying to pull the homeostasis back to where they were before. And she just got in her little car and drove over to his house and says, you will cease and desist. We decided that's not who we are anymore. We just need those kinds of people who could step up in our churches, and it makes a difference. And that person did cease and desist. Never heard from him again. But otherwise, he was stirring up, we're going to take over this church. No, it didn't happen. Because one little lady who was a trusted voice in the church used her voice for good. So I commend investing in those kind of people who can be those E.F. Huttons, who have that capacity to speak truth in those tough situations.
Mm-hmm. Well, I know Kent is a lay leader. So Kent, let me say this just to the pastors for a moment, that it's a different paradigm than what I was taught for pastoring. I was taught the pastor goes in, has a program for the church, tells them what we're going to do, and those who are resistant takes them on and confronts them. This approach we're talking about is where the pastor goes into the church, listens, understands, pays attention, looks for, and notices those people who are ready to move forward in mission and ministry and invests in those people. And that's a primary pathway for cultivating the environment of the church. And that sometimes then, whenever others need confrontation, if you want to call it that, or when a course correction is needed, there are more and more people who can lead in that course correction. So it takes a lot of cultivation work. But it also, when the pastor leaves that church, it's far more likely that culture will remain because it's not dependent on the Lone Ranger hero pastor model, but instead it's a body of Christ kind of model. Kent, being a lay leader, what are you thinking as you're hearing all this today?
Well, actually, I'm not. I'm
He's
the
on staff.
associate pastor.
Oh, I'm sorry. I'm
So
sorry.
it's safe to speak whatever you want to say.
All right.
Everything you've said, Mark, resonates with my experience with where we've been.
I lost
and where
your
we are
sound.
right now.
Can you all hear him?
Uh-huh.
Can you hear me okay?
Oh, there you are.
Yeah.
Yep.
Okay. Everything you've said resonates with where we've been and where we are right now. And I would add to that there are visible, really good, positive experiences happening at First Baptist right now. And the 2 or 3 voices that are the negatives that Chris in particular and Sterling have talked about, who have been so influential in the past, are kind of getting pushed to the sidelines. They don't have any followers much anymore. And so when good things happen, they're left on the outside. They haven't contributed to the good things that everybody else is celebrating. So that's where we're
Okay. Thank you. Thank you. And I apologize too for not knowing your position. And yeah, very good. And also I would say with those resistant voices, it is good for us to listen to them and hear what they have to say. Because oftentimes there's a kernel of truth. And so we want to learn as much as we can. So I'm not discouraging listening to those voices. What I am discouraging is making that where we spend most of our time and energy. And in our thoughts, like Sterling was saying, keeping the conversation going even when they're not, or laying awake at night worried about this and letting it eat away at our souls, laying that aside and instead investing in those who are ready to work, partnering with them, and trusting that we'll go forward in that way. And then what Kent was describing is likely going to be part of the outcome of that over time as we invest in culture change as leaders.
I'm interested by having the mic for an hour a week that we spoke of. What would be, since I have a group of pastors and pastor types, what would be a passage that we could really promote the use your voice for good? Stomp out the evil. Well, I've been using the word evil more than lately around the office this week after some of this. How can we promote this with the Jesus story, let's say? Does anyone have any passages come to mind or any stories of the church?
So this Sunday, literally, one of the lectionary passages is Hebrews 10, 11 through 25. And in 24 and 25, you can translate it, provoke one another to good deeds. And so it is not this, and this is exactly where I'm going in my sermon on Sunday. This is not, we're going to do good things and we're going to encourage you and, kind of passively sit back. But part of being church is not only doing good things, but irritatingly provoking people when they're not to do those things through the love of Christ. And you're doing that because you're showing Christ's love to them. And so, that's literally what I'm talking about on Sunday. So maybe that's helpful. I don't know.
That's a great passage. All right. Anything else you're taking from our conversation today?
A question I have, and this is something I've been struggling with, and sort of to piggyback off on what Diana said. So, we do have the microphone for an hour a week. But part of the things that are the most spiritually malforming, like social media and talk radio and cable news and all those things, they have the microphone for a heck of a lot longer than we do. And so, as valuable as that 1 hour a week is of having the microphone, and really it's only like 20 minutes, right? Because most
Right.
people don't preach an hour. My sermons are between 15 and 20 minutes. So, I've got a quarter to a third of an hour, and they can inject disinformation and spiritual garbage into their veins hours a day, every day of the week. And I've found myself a lot lately, basically telling people, turn that garbage off. It's bad for you. It's when I only have 15 to 20 minutes and they can listen to that for hours. Mm-hmm. And do listen to that for hours every day. How valuable is that hour in comparison? I'm not sure how you're breaking through with that. We had a congregant who was, since got angry and they've left. But she used to talk frequently about how she loved Tucker Carlson, didn't miss a show in the evening. And if she did, she recorded it so she could go back and watch it later. And it's like, this is a guy who is known for, spewing racism and xenophobia and vaccine misinformation and all this sorts of stuff. And she watches him every night or records it in case she misses it. and I have 15 minutes.
Right.
And then she gets angry because I challenged something that Tucker said.
Right. Yeah. Yeah. I hear you. I hear you. This is the world that we find ourselves in at this point in time. So the questions we choose to focus on are instrumental. Like, what do we believe it would take to turn us into reflections of Jesus in this world? If we wanted to do that, what activities would we design? If we wanted to turn this group of human beings into followers of Jesus who could live in the world we live in now with all of the craziness that's going on, what would we do? If that was our goal, what would we do? And I would contrast it to back in the day, back in the 1980s, but 1970s, Sunday school worship, Sunday night service was around some places then. You remember that? Sunday night service, church training, some people remember that. But maybe that was enough at that time, maybe, to turn us into disciples when culture was more static and more homogeneous in some ways, maybe. But whatever our churches are doing now, we probably need something different or more in order for us to have the spiritual strength we need to be reflections of Jesus in our world. So using that 15 minutes, 20 minutes, maybe, to ask some of those questions and invite them into help let's together. Let's design church in a way that we believe positions us to have the best chance of turning ourselves into Christ followers and into people who can live according to the way of Jesus in our world. And whatever we think that is, let's do that. And let's do that for a period of time, maybe for 1 year, and then let's evaluate how are we doing at doing that. One of the things I like, you mentioned Brian McLaren earlier. I was doing a presentation at an event where he was a keynote and I was doing a breakout. And so I got to go to one of his sessions, and somebody asked him, what's our invitation? What are churches inviting people into now? And I remember his statement, which was, come join us. We will help you become a more loving version of yourself. And I thought, that captures a lot of the great commandment, the new commandment, put them together, loving the Lord your God, heart, soul, mind, and strength, love your neighbor as yourself. And we could use that maybe for church evaluation. 6 months from now, we could fast forward to that. And we have a conversation together, and I can say to you, I'm a more loving version of myself than I was 6 months ago because I participate with this church. I'm a more loving version of myself. Or that means we are succeeding at being church together. Or if my answer is, I'm the same as I was, or I'm more of a jerk than I was 6 months ago, I'm a less loving version of myself, we might be failing at being church together if that's the case. So I'm not saying that's what we need to do. What I'm saying is facilitating those kinds of conversations where we talk about the real stuff that's the real stuff is probably going to give us a better chance and opportunity towards being cultures of disciple development and missional progress.
Well, Chris, I know you're the one that's pointing to the one who holds the plumb line, who reminds people afresh every week that that's what we're trying to align to, as opposed to what they might be hearing during the
How'd
week.
you call that sermon, Terry? I appreciate that.
And it's a natural lead into where Mark is taking us next week, because specifically fanning the flame, learning how to align our assets with the way of Jesus. So there is no question, but much of the institutionalized stuff happening in our churches is out of alignment with the way of Jesus. It is patterned more after our culture. So I'm excited to see where he's going to take us with that. And that's a very natural segue for us to think about next week. Any last word before we sign off tonight?
Thank you, everybody, for great engagement and conversation.
Mm-hmm.
Thank you.
Yeah, we do appreciate you journeying with us, and we'll be back